Hey, good morning. It's Coffee with Big Cat, where we have learned that I seem to be relatively tolerable in small doses. Thank you for joining me, for spending some morning with me. Thank you to my scientist friends who reached out and pointed out to me that I am using the term decoherence incorrectly, which I knew that. I was bogeying an arcane piece of science terminology in order to use it for pseudo spiritual purposes, just like that guy Deep Shack Oprah. So, check this out. When I was 14 years old, I went to New York City for the first time. And we were on one of those avenues just to the east of Rockefeller Plaza, and right where those fountains are, and the sidewalk is kind of wide, and people like to eat lunch sitting on the next to the fountain. And I, 14 years old, from Morgan Hill, California, recently Ridgefield, Connecticut, and walking up there, and I see a guy. He has to be 6'5", very, very skinny, no hair, wearing this rumpled, loose coat. He looked kind of like a terminally ill Howard Devoto. And he was standing there on the sidewalk, and he had an electric bass plugged into a battery powered amplifier about this big. And he was thumping the bass. Thump, 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 thump. One or two notes, I forget. And while he was thumping the bass, he was saying, "You gotta keep the beat. You gotta keep the beat. You gotta keep the beat. You gotta keep the beat." And I didn't know if he was quoting this or not, but to me, that was the setup to one of my favorite sixth grade jokes. You gotta keep the beat. You gotta keep the beat. No, I got a booger on my finger and I can't get it off. So I wasn't sure if he was quoting that piece of literature or if he had just arrived at this on his own. But I, being a 14-year-old wearing a fedora and a Dead Kennedy shirt and a spiked wrist bracelet and fluorescent shoelaces on two Nike high tops that don't match, being a little skateboard punk whose heroes were Tony Alva, Dwayne Peters, and Rick Blackheart, and having been recently transported to Ridgefield, Connecticut, I was very enthusiastic about acting weird in public. That was kind of my jam. And so when I saw this guy standing on the sidewalk going, "You gotta keep the beat, you gotta keep the beat," I felt like Carlos Castaneda meeting Don Juan. I felt like Frank Zappa meeting Captain Beefheart. I felt like Samuel Beckett going off, "I'm going to be secretary to James Joyce, and maybe he has a crazy daughter I can fall in love with." So there he was. I thought, well, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. So I walked up to the guy, and I stood in front of him, and I went, "Yeah, man, all right." And I'm looking him in the eye, and I don't know what I was expecting from him, but he didn't look at me. He kept looking over me, and his eyes were full of fear. They were full of terror and agitation, and he just had to stay on that. I've heard OCD loops described as serotonin storms. This guy was in a serotonin storm, and there was nothing but fear and anguish in his eyes, and I could see that I was making him uncomfortable. So I walked away. Now, a couple weeks ago, I was driving down Santa Monica Boulevard, and I saw this woman in this purple flowy costume doing this kind of weird modern dance thing out on Santa Monica Boulevard, some kind of tweaker Merce Cunningham thing. And all the outward trappings of it were joy and self-expression and doing your own thing, the same kind of thing that I was so enthusiastic about seeing with the bass player guy. That's where the outward trappings were. But even from three lanes away over on Santa Monica Boulevard, inside my car, I could feel the pain and the anguish coming off this woman. We've talked a little bit about superstition and what were you doing prior to good things happening to you. I'm sure a lot of you have seen the experiment where the pigeon is given a food pellet at random, and whatever the pigeon was doing prior to getting the food pellet, they start doing that. They start looping on that. They start doing that over and over again, and they make it bigger and more garish and more contorted and stranger over and over, even though this ritual fails to bring another food pellet. And I made all this up, but when looking at this woman and her dance of agony and anguish, I had the feeling this had something to do with showbiz. Whether it was like, well, when I did this in 1985, I got discovered for that music video. I got, yeah, well, superstition tears your mind apart. I talked about that yesterday. She was caught in something. And I talked yesterday also about if you were the kind of person who didn't feel you existed, if you were one of these porous, boundaryless ego creatures who didn't exist until you found validation in the spotlight, if you didn't exist prior to that, what happens when the spotlight is withdrawn from you? And what happens is you cease to exist. And I think that woman was trying to exist. I feel like I walk around and see people who are invisible, who are shells, who are shades. They're living corporeal ghosts walking around because the validation has been removed, and they're spiritually sick and in a mathematical crisis. I said that all yesterday. So I think the button for today is, if you're going to do something creative, make sure all your fibers are coherent. If you're going to create something today, do it with a lot of joy and love, and don't let that pain and anguish and fear get into it. Projects come across my desk, I'll read a script sometimes, and it's a comedy, but it's like, all I get is desperation and fear and anguish, and I can feel that coming off the writer on the script, and you can just feel that like working with this person would be no goddamn fun at all. There's something intangible that goes into the art we create, the crafts we create, and its intent. I'm not saying you have to be in a great mood every day to do your art, but think about your intent. And whatever you do today, don't fall into a robotic response. Don't become a pigeon. Don't fall into an animalistic response. No serotonin storms, no looping, no. The fact of the matter is, you do not gotta keep the beat. You do not gotta keep the beat. You don't gotta keep the beat. This has been Jeff Ayers, Coffee with Big Cat. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you tomorrow.